Quite recently, Games Workshop introduced Vashtorr, who's essentially the arms dealer for the Chaos Army. And as a demigod, he rules over the Forge of Souls, where he creates countless weapons and, more importantly, demon engines. With this, I had an idea to essentially make an alternative for a Chaos Terminator, sort of a replacement. And I thought I'd use an M-bot for this, as it has always reminded me just a little bit of the Terminator armor. And as demons are incredibly powerful, instead of green stuff, I wanted to try something new. But in hindsight, I really should have paid attention to the fact that it said quick type. Because if I'm honest, I genuinely thought this was green stuff, but just of a different color. Now, I'll be using this putty to essentially represent all of the fleshy areas of the demon that are going to be part of this armor. With the first modification being at the midsection, where I drastically changed the posture of the miniature and essentially bulked up the area by providing a lot of these areas where the flesh is just pouring out, creating the idea of scar tissue that is covering the armor and slowly consuming it. Next, I really wanted to add a BFG to this. And with this coming from a knight, this thing will be able to punch a hole in absolutely anything. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to position it, but when I flipped it upside down, I saw the perfect way. I just had to remove a little bit of the notch and make sure that the magazine is not going to be touching the other plate. Similar to an obliterator, the idea here is that essentially the demon has absorbed the gun into itself. As I found working with this putty a hell of a lot easier than using green stuff, I actually had a relatively easy time feathering out and creating this organic transition where the flesh is just covering the armor. Despite this stuff looking a lot like chewing gum, it actually looked pretty good in the model. Now, one of the ideas I initially tested out was using this demonic head to create this sort of like worm-like creature that is sticking out from it, but I had a different idea. There's an interesting piece of lore about the demon engines, where they're essentially able to consume things on the battlefield to replenish their ammo. And then I had an additional thought. What if not just consuming metallic things, it also consumed organics to repair its tissue? It's both grimdark and kind of awesome. I'm sure this guardsman would disagree, but it is what it is. Even though deep inside I knew this was not gonna work, a part of me did consider putting on this chicken wing. I did have a perfect alternative, which is essentially the arm from the Age of Sigmar Crypt Horror. Not only was the size similar enough, but it also had an appearance that was vague enough that could not really be attributed to one of the 4 Chaos gods and instead looked like a demon of Vashtorr. I then wanted to use some of the putty to essentially bulk up the shoulder and make it feel like it's growing out of the armor quite organically. When I finished up on the shoulder, I went to get a bit of lunch, and when I was back about 30 minutes later, I found that this stuff was now incredibly hard. This was just roughly over an hour of me working with this stuff, and it was incredibly difficult to try to reshape it. So I had to abandon the idea of the perfect shoulder, but fortunately enough, I did find an extra cable that I didn't even know I had. When I destroyed the accursed cultist to make my World Eater Terminator, I had this really cool arm left over. With his pincer poleaxe, it'll essentially represent a power sword, a devastating weapon that will cut through anything in front of him. Instead of sculpting a lot of the biological flesh that is taking over the arm, I wanted to preserve this cog-looking joint. I wanted to reinforce the idea that it's not even clear where the demon begins and the machine ends, as they are both technically one. The connection was the furthest thing from perfect, so I used a lot of Tamiya thin cement to really melt the area down and give it a lot more of a smoother feel. I did make an attempt to slightly readjust the posture, but at this point, the putty was solid. Now, the primary reason this thing would be replacing a Chaos Terminator is because there really isn't anything else it could count as on the tabletop, because at this size and the 40mm base, there just really isn't anything else that'll match it, especially with a massive gun. But for a Terminator, it is perfect. Now, to make him feel like a demon engine, I wanted to dry brush some metallics. It's a relatively simple and straightforward process, but it always gives incredible results. Now, if you would have been dry brushing with paints, I personally recommend a dry brush palette. It works a little bit better than a piece of cardboard, but with metallics, this is a little bit different because they come off much smoother, so it's not really necessary. To achieve the effect of this very dark looking metal, I wanted to use a large amount of very small strokes while not applying too much pressure. I find that priming the miniature in a non-glossy paint gives you this effect of almost a cast iron looking metal, giving the miniature an overall heavier feel and just a much more realistic tone to it. For the skin tone, as I wanted to achieve a very demonic looking tone to it, I decided to go with leather brown and then make it incredibly pale by mixing a lot of white into it. By using this lifeless and desaturated color, I really wanted to showcase that there's absolutely no blood pumping through the veins of this demon. It is dead demonic flesh that is being stretched over the metal skeleton of this horrifying creature. For the highlights, I proceeded to slowly add just a tiny amount of white. To create the idea of decayed flesh on the guardsman, I used snakebite leather and militarum green, mixed in a roughly 50-50 ratio. This Daemon Engine doesn't always consume them and sometimes just carries them around as an extra snack on the go. The cries and moans of suffering are simply songs to a demon. I wanted to create a wash for the demon's skin, so I used Guilliman flesh and Grim Black, with 2 parts Guilliman flesh and 1 part Grim Black. And it had such a nice and grimy tone to it that I decided to apply it all over the armor panels, shifting the tone in a slightly warmer hue. Then, using a red crimson ink, I want to create a very distinct and red glowing focal point coming from the top lens, which will give the resemblance that this faceless abomination now has a crazy looking cyclops eye. Then, to finish this very simple glowing OSL effect, I finish it off with a bit of white at the center of the lens. Now arguably, it's probably good enough to stop right here, but I did want to do a little bit more with this OSL effect. I used AK Prime Red to create the areas where the light is hitting the edges of the objects around it. It's a small detail, but I always enjoy it. When I finished the OSL effect, I did feel like the skin tones were just a little bit too dark, making it very difficult to distinguish between the transition of the armor and the arm, so I decided to come in with the highlight using the exact same tone as before, but then doing an additional highlight by adding in just a bit of ice yellow to it. The reason for using the ice yellow here rather than the white is that it doesn't desaturate the color and it does slightly shift it in the warmer hue, making the highlight feel a little bit more organic. Personally, I always enjoy having 2 colors that are essentially complementary but are bright and saturated. So I thought it'd be kinda cool to use frog green to create the idea that the claws in this monster are poisonous. I could have gone with an alternative of blue that would have worked just as well, but I didn't really think that the idea of electric claws would be as interesting as having these green poisonous claws. And for the final highlight of the green claws, I did mix in just a bit of ice yellow. And for the pincer claw, I repeated the exact same step, but this time using the airbrush to simplify some of the steps for me. Then I took a little bit of chrome and mixed it to the base color of steel to create the idea there's just a bunch of little scratch marks on the armor. This is where having an old and frayed brush is actually quite helpful. And of course, finished it off with a cherry on top. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, and let's see the final result.